There is a school, somewhere in the Velorian cluster, that has survived 11,000 years of academic tradition without a single scandal. No cheating incidents, no failed graduates, no dropout rates worth mentioning. The Akademi Veloris, carved into the side of a cooling moon called Drath Vel, has produced generals, diplomats, xenobiologists, and at least 3 sitting Galactic Council members. It is, by every measurable standard, the finest institution of higher learning in the known universe. And then they admitted a human. Nobody voted for it. That is the part the faculty still argues about during their long, miserable staff meetings. Director Chauvin Oreth, a thin-limbed Velorian with too many opinions and not enough patience, had apparently decided unilaterally that admitting one specimen from the newly contacted species called Homo sapiens would be, and I quote directly from his official memo, a gesture of goodwill toward a species that has yet to demonstrate why we should be gesturing goodwill toward them. The human's name was Priya Nair. She arrived on a transport vessel with one duffel bag, a scratched-up tablet loaded with music nobody else recognized, and an expression on her face that the Velorian intake coordinator, a nervous young fellow named Torvash, described afterward as disturbingly unbothered. He had expected tears, maybe. Awe, certainly. The Akademi's entrance hall is 300 meters tall and lit by captured bioluminescent organisms that have been glowing continuously since before humans discovered agriculture. Most new students spend their first hour simply standing and staring upward. Priya walked through it while eating a granola bar. Torvash filed a report. Now, let me explain something about the Akademi's curriculum, because this is important. The academic year is divided into 4 cycles, and each cycle ends with what is called the Verak. The Verak is not an exam exactly. It is not a project either. The closest translation from Velorian into any human language is something like, the thing you must survive to continue. The faculty invented it after noticing roughly 800 years ago that written exams were excellent at measuring what a student had memorized but catastrophically bad at measuring whether that student would function when the universe stopped cooperating. So they built something worse. Each Verak is different. Each one is designed specifically for the cycle just completed, drawing on every skill taught in those preceding months. They happen in real environments, under real conditions, with real consequences, not fatal consequences. The Akademi has a legal obligation to return students to their home planets with most of their organs, but consequences that are uncomfortable enough that the failure rate hovers consistently around 40% per cycle. 40%. Every cycle. 11,000 years of tradition. Priya's cohort was a group of 23 students. She was the only human. The others included a pair of Dracian twins named Kove and Melith, whose species communicated primarily through color shifts in their skin and who found spoken language exhausting. A Thurvian named Peloki, who stood 2.5 meters tall, had 4 arms, and spent most of his free time writing poetry nobody asked to read. A quiet, silver-skinned Nalvesi named Oshrin, who was almost certainly smarter than everyone else in the room and made sure everyone knew it without ever being rude about it, which was somehow more infuriating than if he had just been rude. And a Cathari named Wolanda, who had transferred from a competitor institution under circumstances she declined to explain, and who sat in the back of every lecture with her secondary eyelids half closed, watching everything. They had completed Cycle 1 together. They had studied xenolinguistics, advanced stellar navigation, comparative political structures, and something the Akademi called pressure cognition, which was exactly what it sounded like. Learning to think clearly while everything around you was actively trying to prevent that. It was during pressure cognition that Priya had first started making the rest of the cohort nervous, not because she struggled, because she did not. Professor Davith, a Velorian with 30 years of teaching experience and the kind of permanent exhausted expression that comes from spending those 30 years trying to make young minds crack under controlled stress, had subjected the cohort to 17 escalating scenarios across the cycle. Kove and Melith had broken down on Scenario 9, Peloqui had frozen entirely on Scenario 12, and spent 40 minutes writing a poem about the experience instead of completing the exercise. Oshrin had made it to scenario 15 before his performance degraded significantly, which was the best result in recorded cohort history. Priya had completed all 17, not smoothly, not gracefully. On scenario 14, she had made a decision that David described in his notes as technically incorrect by every established framework, but which produced the correct outcome through means I am still attempting to categorize. On scenario 16, she had apparently started laughing partway through, which was not a response David had observed in 3 decades of teaching. He asked her about it afterward. It got absurd, she said. When something gets absurd enough, sometimes laughing is just the honest response. David did not know what to do with that. He wrote it down and sent it to Director Chauvin, who read it twice and then put it in a file he kept specifically for things Priya had said or done that he did not know what to do with. That file was by the end of cycle 1, 17 pages long. The morning of the first Verak arrived on a Drath Vel Tuesday, which means nothing to you but was significant to the students, because Drath Vel Tuesdays are when the moon's orbit brings it closest to the system's gas giant, and the gravitational shift does something unpleasant to the inner ear of most species registered at the Akademi. The timing was not accidental. The Akademi had never once accidentally scheduled anything. The cohort assembled in the staging area, a large, bare room on the facility's lower level, at the 6th hour. They were given no briefing. This was traditional. The Verak did not announce itself. It simply began. A door at the far end of the staging room opened. On the other side was a corridor that connected, eventually, to the Akademi's deep archive, a 6-level structure built into the moon's subsurface that housed physical records, biological samples, and various objects accumulated over 11 millennia of institutional existence. It was not, under normal circumstances, a place students accessed. Under current circumstances, it was the location of the Verak. The instruction came from a speaker embedded in the ceiling. 1 sentence, 11 words in Velorian Standard, which all students had been required to achieve fluency in before enrollment. Retrieve the Orath Codex from Archive Level 4 and return it here. Then the door sealed behind them. Oshrin identified the problem first, because Oshrin always identified problems first. He turned to the cohort with his silver skin pulling slightly toward gray, which in Nalvesi physiology indicated concern, and explained in precise, unhurried language that Archive Level 4 was sealed. It had been sealed for 60 years following an incident involving a malfunctioning environmental system that had permanently altered the atmospheric composition of the level's interior. The air down there was technically breathable for most registered species for approximately 37 minutes. After that, the chemical compounds present would begin producing effects ranging from severe cognitive impairment to structural damage to lung tissue. 37 minutes, Wolanda repeated from the back of the group. Her secondary eyelids were fully open now. For which species? Average, Oshrin said. Individual variation applies. Cove and Melith flickered yellow at each other, rapidly the way they did when they were having a private conversation at speed. Peliqui raised one of his 4 hands and asked whether writing a formal complaint to the administration was an available option. Nobody answered him. How far is Level 4 from here? Priya asked. The archive entrance is a 9-minute walk from this position, Oshrin said. Level 4 is 4 levels below the entrance, which adds stairs or lift. Lifts are not operational below Level 2. The infrastructure was damaged in the same incident. So stairs. How many? Oshrin blinked. The question was specific in a way he had not anticipated. Approximately 300 steps between each level. So from Level 2 to Level 4, roughly 600 steps descending, plus the same ascending. Priya was already doing something with her tablet. Her fingers moved quickly across the surface, pulling up what looked like architectural data. She had, Torvash would later confirm, filed a records access request for Akademi facility schematics within her first 2 weeks of enrollment. Citing academic curiosity, and been granted access because nobody had thought to designate those files restricted. "Okay," she said. 9 minutes to the entrance, we lose 2 minutes getting oriented on level 1. We can do level 2 in roughly 4 minutes if we move directly. Then the stairs to level 4, call it 6 minutes if we're not sprinting, less if we are. Finding the codex on level 4 depends on how well organized their shelving system is after 60 years of nobody touching it. She looked up. "What does the Orath Codex physically look like?" The cohort stared at her. "It is bound in the traditional Velorian style," Ashran said after a pause. "Dark binding, approximately 40 centimeters in length, with the family seal embossed on the front. It should be shelved under the Administrative History collection." "Where in the level is Administrative History?" "Eastern Wing. If the archive follows standard Akademi organization." "Does it?" "I have no data on whether the interior organization survived the environmental incident intact." Priya nodded, like this was a perfectly satisfying answer, and started walking toward the corridor. "Then we move fast, we adapt when we get there, and we don't waste time on variables we can't solve yet. Who here is physically fastest on stairs?" The cohort, after a moment of stunned silence, began moving. Nobody had elected Priya to anything. She held no position in the cohort hierarchy. The Akademi did not formally assign such things, but social structures form regardless, and the unspoken assumption among most of the group had been that Ashran, with his demonstrable cognitive advantages, would function as the natural leader in high-stakes scenarios. Ashran himself had not discouraged this assumption, but Ashran was currently following Priya down the corridor, reviewing his own architectural memory for details he had not thought to catalog, because she had asked him questions he had not thought to ask himself, and he was finding the experience both irritating and instructive. The archive entrance was exactly where the schematics indicated. The door was sealed with a mechanical lock. Electronic systems in the subsurface levels had been partially disabled as a precautionary measure following the incident, which meant no electronic override was possible. Walanda looked at it for approximately 4 seconds, produced a thin tool from somewhere in her jacket, and had it open in 45 seconds. She offered no explanation, and nobody asked for one. Level 1 was dim and cold, and smelled of age. The shelving units ran in long rows, floor to ceiling, packed with documents, artifacts, and containers whose labels had faded to illegibility in places. The cohort moved through it quickly, Priya counting their time in her head aloud, not for drama, but because she had decided the cohort needed an external clock. 11 minutes elapsed, she said as they hit the level 2 stairwell. "We've got 26 in reserve before cognitive effects start. We find it in 10, we're out with 16 minutes of margin." "And if we do not find it in 10, Cove asked. It was the most either of the twins had said since the exercise began, and they said it in careful, accented Velorian standard, their skin cycling through a muted green that translated roughly as focused apprehension. "Then we find it in 11, Priya said, and started down the stairs. Level 4 hit them like a wall. The atmosphere was wrong in a way that was immediately, physically apparent. Not dramatically wrong, not gasping and choking wrong, just subtly, persistently wrong. The way a room feels when something in it is slightly off and your body notices before your brain does. Melith's color shifted involuntarily, a reflexive response their species had to atmospheric contamination. Peloquy made a low sound in his throat. Ashran's skin pulled to a near white. Priya sneezed once, wiped her nose, and kept walking. "Eastern Wing," she said. "Let's go." The eastern wing of Archive Level 4 had not been touched in 60 years, and it showed. Shelving units that had once stood in precise, orderly rows had partially collapsed against each other, leaning at angles that made navigation feel like moving through a forest after a bad storm. Documents had slid from their positions, some falling to the floor in drifts, some caught halfway between shelf and ground, suspended there by nothing more than friction and the particular stubbornness of old paper. The labels on the shelving units were present, technically, but the atmospheric conditions over 6 decades had done something unkind to the ink, leaving them faded to the point where reading them required stopping, leaning close and squinting with the kind of focused desperation usually reserved for people who have lost their glasses at the worst possible moment. Oshrin announced their time elapsed as they entered the eastern wing. 16 minutes. They had, by his calculation, 21 minutes remaining before the cohort's average exposure tolerance was exceeded. Individual variation, he reminded them, applied. Peloquy had already begun to look unwell. His skin, normally a deep blue-gray, had acquired a slightly greenish undertone that his species did not naturally produce, and he was blinking more than usual, which in Thurvians indicated early neurological irritation. He had not complained. He had instead begun composing under his breath, quiet rhythmic murmuring that the others had learned over the course of the cycle was his stress response. When Peloquy got anxious, he made poetry, the way some people tap their fingers or chew their lips. Yolanda was scanning the collapsed shelving with her secondary eyelids fully extended, using the enhanced light sensitivity her species developed for low-visibility environments. Administrative history, she said, moving along the right wall. If the Eastern Wing maintained standard organization, the administrative collection runs along the outer wall. The incident that sealed this level, was it uniform across the floor or localized? Nobody knew. I'm asking, Yolanda said patiently, because if the collapse was localized to a specific area, the outer wall shelving may be more intact than the interior rows. That is a reasonable inference, Oshrin said. Then help me check the outer wall. Priya was already there. She had moved along the perimeter while the others were still processing the room, running her fingers along the shelf labels not to read them, but to feel the embossing beneath the faded ink, where the physical impression in the material was sometimes still legible when the ink itself was not. It was slow. It was also faster than standing in the middle of the room making reasonable inferences. Cove, she called, without turning around. You and Melith take the interior rows from the north end. Oshrin, work the outer wall from the south. Yolanda, help me here. Peloquy, she glanced back at him and registered his color. Stay near the stairwell entrance. You're our timer and our early warning. If you start feeling worse, you say so immediately. Peloquy looked briefly like he wanted to argue, because Thurvians had a cultural tradition around refusing to be the person who stayed back, but his current neurological state appeared to be winning the argument on his behalf. He nodded and moved back toward the stairwell, still murmuring. 19 minutes elapsed, he called. From his position, the cohort split and moved. The next 4 minutes were the kind of quiet that only exists when a group of people are working too hard and too urgently to talk. The sounds were small. The scrape of fingers along shelf edges, the soft collapse of disturbed documents, the occasional sharp intake of breath when someone moved a shelf unit and found only more shelf units behind it. Cove and Melith communicated entirely through skin color in the low light, their conversation silent and rapid and incomprehensible to everyone else. Oshrin moved with methodical precision along the southern wall, cataloging and eliminating sections with the systematic efficiency that made him genuinely excellent at tasks where the correct approach was known and required only execution. The problem, in this particular room, was that the correct approach kept hitting walls. 23 minutes, Peloquy called. His voice was slightly thicker than it had been. I am also, he added, experiencing what I believe is the opening stanza of a rather good sonnet, if anyone is interested. Not right now, Peloquy, Yolanda said. I understand. I will hold it. Priya had worked her way 3/4 along the outer eastern wall and found administrative finance records, administrative facilities records, administrative personnel records going back 400 years, and a sealed container whose label she genuinely could not decode at all. She stopped at the container, considered it for half a second, and moved on. The codex was a bound document. 40 centimeters, dark binding. She was looking for something specific, and she was not going to lose time on something sealed. Then Cove's skin turned a color that had no clean Velorian translation, but which Melith later described as the color of a thing being found. It was behind a collapsed shelf unit in the northeast interior, which was not along the outer wall, and was not where standard organization would have placed it. It was on the floor, partially beneath the fallen unit, its dark binding visible only because the shelf had fallen at an angle that left a gap just wide enough to see through. The Orath Codex had apparently been knocked from its position at some point during the incident 60 years ago, slid off its shelf, and come to rest in the exact location least likely to be found by anyone looking for it, in the place it was supposed to be. Melith signaled to Priya immediately. Getting to it took 2 minutes. The shelf unit was heavy enough that even Peloqui's 4 arms, which would have made it trivial, were currently occupied with keeping Peloqui vertical near the stairwell entrance. Oshrin and Priya took one side. Wolanda and Cove took the other. Melith positioned themselves ready to extract the codex the moment a gap opened. On account that Priya gave in English because she reached for it instinctively under pressure and then immediately repeated in Velorian, they lifted. The shelf unit moved. Not far, 30 centimeters maybe, but enough. Melith had the codex in both hands before the count finished. 27 minutes elapsed, Peloqui said, from the stairwell. His voice was noticeably impaired now, the consonants softening in the way that happened to Thurvian speech when their neurological processing was under physiological stress. I am also now fairly certain I need to be above ground. Going now, Priya said. The return was faster than the descent, because fear is an excellent performance enhancer, and because Peloqui, whatever his current condition, was not going to be the reason the cohort failed its first Verak. He moved up the stairs with all 4 arms engaged on the handrails, pulling himself upward with a determination that his species poets had written about extensively, and which, in practice, looked less heroic and more like a very large, mildly poisoned individual refusing to fall down through sheer stubbornness. They cleared level 4 at 29 minutes. Level 3 felt like clean air by comparison, which was objectively untrue but subjectively overwhelming. Melith's color stabilized. Oshrin's skin returned from near white to silver. Priya sneezed again, twice in quick succession, and kept moving. They did not stop. The staging room door was sealed when they reached it. Of course it was. The Akademi had never once made anything easy on purpose, and the idea that the exit would simply open for them on request was the kind of optimism that 11,000 years of institutional tradition had specifically engineered out of its graduates. There was a panel beside the door. It required, according to the small text etched beside it, a 5-character code entered in Velorian numeric script. The cohort stared at it. 22 minutes of margin, Oshrin said, and then added, with what might have been the faintest suggestion of reluctant admiration, assuming everyone recovers within normal parameters. Did any of us see a 5-character code anywhere in the archive? Wolanda asked. Silence. The container, Priya said. Everyone looked at her. The sealed container on the outer wall, 3/4 along. I couldn't read the main label, but there was a secondary marking on the latch. I didn't stop to decode it because I was looking for the codex, but it was a short marking, 5 characters. More silence. You did not retrieve it, Oshrin said. No, you did not note the characters. I moved past it quickly, but I remember what it looked like. She was already at the panel. Velorian numeric script has 32 characters. The first one I saw was one of the compound forms. 2 strokes vertical, 1 diagonal. That's character 19 in the standard sequence. She entered it. Second was a single loop, closed. Character 7. She entered it. I'm less sure about the third. It was partially obscured by the latch mechanism itself. It looked like either character 3 or character 30. Both have similar upper geometry. She stopped. Character 3, Wolanda said, without explanation. Priya entered character 3. 4th and 5th I'm confident about. 4 strokes in a descending arrangement, character 24, and a double horizontal, which is character 2. She entered them. The panel sat there for a moment that lasted approximately 1 geological era. Then it chimed, and the door opened. Professor Davith was waiting on the other side, along with Director Chauvin and 2 other faculty members whose presence indicated that someone had decided this particular Verak warranted observation. Davith's expression was professionally neutral, which was the expression he used when he was trying not to indicate that something unexpected had occurred. Director Chauvin's expression was the specific expression he wore when something had been added to the file. Melith stepped forward and placed the Orith Codex on the table in front of them. The faculty said nothing for a moment. Then David looked at the cohort's elapsed time on his recording device, looked at Peloqui's current color, looked at the codex, and made a note. The debrief came the next morning. Each student was assessed individually, which was standard, and then the cohort was assessed as a unit, which was also standard. The faculty reviewed the recorded data from the monitoring systems that, it turned out, had been running throughout the entire exercise. Cameras in the archive, atmospheric sensors, motion tracking. David ran through the cohort's performance methodically. Cove and Melith received commendation for their communication efficiency in low visibility conditions and their rapid identification of the codex's location. Wolanda received a note in her file that said only lockpicking, institutional policy query pending, which she accepted without expression. Oshran received acknowledgement of his systematic approach to the outer wall search and a quiet comment, delivered without fanfare, that his response time to novel organizing frameworks had improved relative to his prior assessment. Peloqui received medical clearance, a grade that reflected his decision to stay at the stairwell entrance as a rational resource allocation rather than a failure of participation, and a formal request from David on behalf of the Akademi's Cultural Archive Department for a copy of the sonnet he had composed during the exercise. Peloqui's color went immediately and involuntarily to a bright, saturated orange, which in Thurvians indicated pure joy. Then David came to Priya. He was quiet for a moment, reviewing his notes with the air of someone choosing words with care. "The code entry," he said finally. "Walk me through your reasoning on character 3 versus character 30. 30 has a small serif at the base of the right stroke," Priya said. "Even obscured, I would expect to see the serif if it was 30. I didn't. Character 3 doesn't have it." "You were correct. I know." David looked at her for a long moment. "You moved past the container. I was focused on the primary objective, but you retained the information anyway. I retain a lot of things I don't know I'll need yet." Director Chauvin, who was sitting at the back of the debrief room and had not spoken once during the entire session, wrote something on his document that nobody else could see. The file was now, by conservative estimate, 20 pages long. There was a tradition at the Akademi, older than most of its current faculty, of marking exceptional first Verak results with a small notation in the institutional record. Not a celebration, the Akademi did not celebrate, it documented. A notation, a single line added to the archive, recording that in this cycle, in this cohort, something had happened that was worth remembering. The last time that notation had been added was 43 years ago. Torvash, the intake coordinator, who happened to be passing the administrative office the following morning, later described hearing the sound of the official record being updated, the specific, formal tone that the system produced when a new institutional notation was entered. He stopped in the corridor. He looked at the doorway, and then he thought about a human walking through a 300-meter entrance hall, eating a granola bar, looking at nothing in particular. He did not file a report this time. He just walked on, very quietly, feeling something he would later identify, after consulting a xenocultural reference guide, as the particular sensation of watching something the universe had not quite gotten around to expecting yet. The Akademi Veloris had survived 11,000 years of academic tradition without a single scandal. It had 3 more cycles to go.